I got a story time for you guys tonight, and it is the story of Cobra from Fairy Tale. I so this guy was sold into slavery. You know, people who were trying to resurrect Seraph. We need to build this tower. We'll have these kids build it for us. You know, these people we capture, and he was one of those children. His name was Eric. You know, he had a pet snake named Cabellos. He was found, him and, five other people were found by a guy named Zero. Or it was him and four other people were found by a guy named Brain, actually. His alter ego is Zero. But he was one of the, you know, members of the Ration Safe. He then went on to be one of the more powerful members of that guild. Of only six people, they had weaker guilds underneath them. But they got so powerful to the point, Fairy Tale had to join a coalition with Lamia Skill and Blue Pegasus to bring them down. He is a poison dragon slayer of the second generation. So he got the dragon slayer magic, the dragon lack of mud planted in him, when he became, one of the members, right? And this guy also had other magic too. He had amplified hearing. He could hear your thoughts. He knew what you were thinking about. And he knows everybody's thoughts. Um, Except somebody I'll talk about that, I'll get to that point soon. But he ended up fighting against Urza first. She tried to attack him, but like I said, he knew how she would attack, you know. So she got poisoned by him, right? Boom. Hit her with the snake, bit her. And then he was like, whatever, he was told to go after Jalal. And Jalal, was, no, found by him, right? Then he ended up fighting against Natsu. When he fought against Natsu, he was actually, poisoning him a little bit. And he was, reading his mind. That's not the smartest guy in the world, but he was able to think on the fly, and he was like, the only way to counteract, this guy's, he can hear shit, so he has like, sensitive hearing. I'm gonna scream very, very loud, and then basically rupture his eardrum, since his ears are so sensitive. He can hear shit from like, that's in your mind. He can hear what you're thinking. Yeah. But if I'm loud, I'll just rupture his eardrum. And that's what happened to him. And that's how he was defeated. Even Brain was like, I dismiss you. You're of no use to me now. Then he got captured by Lahar, and he was put in prison until 7 years later when they needed him. He knew that they were coming to get him because of his magic. He could still hear, from like far distances, and they were like, oh, now you need my help because you're fighting dragons. I'll help you. He ended up helping them out. He ended up fighting against this like rock dragon. It was sent through the gate. Um, However, after he got, sent back to prison, he told them that, the Tartaros Guild was going to make moves, and he did warn them about that because he could hear that too. and they were like, whatever. But then, a couple months later, they then attacked. But when this demon jackal attacked, it freed the Irrational States. They were able to, they had freedom after, like, basically, like, their whole life was, like, controlled. First, he was a slave in the Tower of Heaven doing that shit for Jalal, and then he was manipulated by, you know, Brain to, run around and destroy these people for the sake of the Irrational States. You know, had they never been, through that, they had freedom now. He wanted to find his snake, Cobelios, which turned into a woman, and she basically became a member of Fairy Tale. And he wanted to find her again, right? Jalal, being in a similar situation, finds these guys and is like, hey, I hear you and all this shit, but you can't just run around and act like all the bad shit you did was, like to like other people, innocent people, you know, that's like going away. You gotta, better yourselves. You gotta, repent for what you've done. And he actually killed he killed Brain too when they got freed. He actually, killed him. Boom. He was like, this guy's, manipulated our lives, and he's talking to Midnight because Midnight's like the leader, and he's actually the only one that's more powerful than him. Minus zero. And he's like, we can't, follow him no more. We need our freedom. I know that's your daddy or whatever, but you know, is that fine? And he's like, yeah, But then they got convinced by Jalal to, just join him, and it was still freedom, but they had to also recognize that they did do that, so they had to, turn good, they had to turn a new leaf. They couldn't just, continue to just, make people's lives miserable, innocent people, right? So he joined Jalal. He helped out during the fight against Alvarez. They fought against who? August. But obviously they lost. And he was part of that team, right? He got obliterated with everybody else. And Jalal was right there with them, you know. After the Alvarez incident, well, after all that shit went down with Zeref and he was defeated, right? Acnologia summoned the Dragon Slayers to the rift between time, and he was one of them, right? So he started to help everybody out. But it's Acnologia. No damage dealt to this guy, right? If you watch Fairy Tale, you know how powerful this guy is, right? So, um, Cobra then gives his energy to Natsu so he can, defeat Acnologia. Then he was knighted by Hisagi. Is that her name? Hisui. No. Princess Hisui. He was knighted by Hisui, who became queen of Fiore, and their crimes were, excused, expunged, right? Because they helped out during this battle against Seraph and Nakamuga. And he became, a good guy. And he appears in the 100-Year Quest manga, but we ain't gonna go into that. But be cool, call in the corner, and let me know what you think about this guy in the comments. He ain't the strongest dragon slayer. I think he's probably the weakest one. Well, maybe not the weakest one, but he's one of the weaker ones. But be cool, call in the corner.